Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Jen. I work within the Positive Voices programme at Terrence Higgins Trust. We're here for the virtual village call for LGBT plus History Month, and we're talking today about HIV. And I'm joined by two of our amazing speakers who you're going to hear from later, Mark and Stephen. Before we kick off, I wanted to start by telling you a bit about who we are and where we've come from. So the Terrence Higgins Trust was formed in the early 80s at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, the death of Terry Higgins, who you can see pictured here. He was one of the first people to die of AIDS-related illnesses. And at the time, there was a real lack of information about what was going on. People were getting really unwell, they were dying, there was huge amounts of fear. So after Terry died, his friends came together and formed the trust. At the time, it was a group of volunteers in a single room providing phone support to people living with HIV and their friends and family. From there, they went on to work with healthcare professionals, lobby the government, develop campaigns. And over the last 40 years, we've grown, and we're now the largest HIV and sexual health charity in Europe. Our vision is a world where people living with HIV live long, healthy, happy lives. They don't experience any stigma or discrimination. And whilst we started with HIV, we're now also focusing on wider sexual health. And we want to make sure that good sexual health is a right and reality for everyone. So we always have a bit of a group agreement at the beginning of our session. So for anyone joining us live today, please do ask questions. It's a judgment-free zone. So if there's anything you've ever wanted to ask about HIV or AIDS, but felt afraid or uncomfortable, please do so today. You can put questions in the comments, or if you want to ask any questions anonymously, there'll be a link in the chat to Slido where you can ask questions anonymously, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. We're going to cover some topics that might be a bit challenging for some people, so please do take care of yourself. If you're joining us live, you can always step out. We're recording the session, so you'll be able to join us later if you want to and watch it again. A bit of a content warning. Obviously, the nature of the session, we're going to be covering sex and sexuality. If you're younger, this might not be appropriate for you, so please talk to a parent or carer before viewing. And we're going to be covering topics such as homophobia, transphobia, HIV stigma, and sexual abuse. So if this is something that might be upsetting for you, please do consider whether this is the right session for you. And we will have at the very end of the session some information on other organisations you can go to for information and support on those topics. So it's always good to have some goals. And so for this session, we want to firstly leave you feeling really confident that you have the most up-to-date and correct knowledge about HIV. We want you to feel empowered to make confident choices about your sex life that are right for you. And we want you to help us eradicate HIV stigma. And just by being here today, you're doing that. And we're going to do that through, I'm going to share some information with you for a bit. And like I said, then our speakers are going to share their stories with you. So HIV and AIDS, you've probably heard both of these terms. You might have even heard them used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. So I'm going to tell you a bit about both of them now. So HIV is the human immunodeficiency virus. It's the infectious virus that attacks the immune system. We emphasize the human there for two really important reasons. One, when we think about viruses and transmission, it can be really clinical and it can be easy to forget why we're doing this. So we always want to bring it back to the people who are at the heart of everything that we do. Also, in the right conditions, any human can contract HIV. It can affect anyone. And I will talk a bit about what those conditions are in a minute. If someone has HIV and it goes untreated for a while, it can develop into AIDS, and that's acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And that's when the HIV virus weakens the immune system to the point that it can't fight off what we call opportunistic infections. So these are things that, say, someone with a healthy immune system would be able to fight off. So it might be flus or TB or cancer. It's not actually HIV that makes you sick. It's these other infections that can make you really unwell. Thankfully, we have amazing medication. We have amazing treatment. So we don't really talk about AIDS anymore in this country. We might think about late diagnosis, which I'll talk about later. So I mentioned that in the right conditions, anyone can contract the virus. And these are those conditions. The first one is the bodily fluid. Human beings are very oozy, gooey creatures. We have loads of different kinds of bodily fluids, but there are only actually 5 that can hold enough of the virus for it to be transmittable from person to person. And these fluids are blood, semen, vaginal fluids, breast milk, and anal mucus. I'm sure you weren't expecting to hear about anal mucus today. There you go. It's really important to know that any of the fluids that aren't on that list aren't going to be a risk to you. So things like sweat, tears, saliva, urine, absolutely no problem. So condition 1 has to be one of those 5 fluids. Condition 2 is about quality and time. So HIV is a really weak virus. It doesn't survive very long outside the body. So whereas things like some colds and flus, you can sneeze, it'll be on surfaces, you touch them, pick it up. As soon as HIV leaves the body, it starts to degrade and it doesn't really survive for more than a few minutes. So it has to go really quickly from person to person. So condition 1 is it has to be one of those 5 fluids. Condition 2 is those fluids have to go really quickly from person to person. And the last condition is the route. So that's how it transmits from person to person. In the UK, the most common route of transmission is sex without a preventative method. So that's like condoms. It can transmit either way. So whether you're the insertive or the receptive partner, HIV can transmit both ways. The second most common route of transmission, although far less than through sex, is sharing needles through injecting drug users. This slide shows the data for the last few years, so rates of transmission. As you can see, we're generally reducing the rate of transmission, which is amazing, with huge successes there. You'll see, though, that now we're seeing more transmission between heterosexual sex than in sex between men. And that's partly because of the huge work we've done with that community through education, through medication and treatment. There's much more work to be done through educating heterosexuals and making them aware of their risks. You'll see there that there's mention of vertical transmission. That is from mother to baby, but we've practically eliminated that in the UK. Once you become pregnant, you'll be routinely tested for HIV here. And if you're found to be carrying the virus, you'll be put on medication, which will stop you transmitting it to your baby, which is a huge success. That 1% other can include historical transmission for people that have moved to the UK recently. Historically, people might have contracted the virus through infected blood products or organs. But again, in the UK, we routinely test these, so we've eradicated that as a source of transmission here. So a bit of data for you here. So globally, 39 million people are living with HIV. I find it quite hard to visualize that. So I don't think that's about the same size as the population of Canada. Sadly, we've lost about the same number of people since the beginning of the AIDS crisis to today. In the UK, there are just under 107,000 people living with HIV. And of those, we think there are about 5,000 people that have the virus but don't know. If you're someone that is sexually active or potentially sharing needles and hasn't had an HIV test in a while, you could be one of those 5,000. So it's great that you're here today and learning about HIV. I mentioned late diagnosis earlier. This is when somebody tests positive for HIV after the virus has started to damage their immune system. It means you have a higher risk of becoming unwell and contracting those opportunistic infections I mentioned. In the UK, almost half of diagnoses were late in 2022, but some communities are much more likely to be diagnosed late than others. So heterosexual men, Black people of African heritage, and those over 50. It's not all doom and gloom, though. HIV treatment protects the immune system, even if you're diagnosed late. So it's really important for people to get tested and know their status. They can be put on treatment and become healthy. So whilst HIV isn't the death sentence that it used to be, it's obviously better not to contract the virus in the first place. And we have 4 key tools to help do that. The first one is condoms. I'm not going to spend too long talking about that because I'm sure many people know about these already, but they remain the most effective way to prevent against HIV transmission of most STIs, and to prevent unwanted pregnancy. You can often get free condoms in a sexual health clinic if you happen to have an appointment there already. If you're under 25, you can sign up for a C-card scheme. You can find these online, and they give you free access to condoms and lube at a range of locations in your area. Testing. It's come a really long way since the 80s, and we're improving testing all the time. It's free and confidential, and results can be really quick. We're going to put a link in the chat to where you can find an HIV test in your local area. There's different kinds of tests, as you might see from the pictures there. If you go into a sexual health clinic, you might get a blood draw from the arm, or if you get a home testing kit, you might get a finger prick where you just collect a few drops of blood in a vial and post it off. Or we have self-swab kits in your gums, and they can actually give you a result within 15 minutes. All of those different types of tests can give you an accurate result within 45 days of potential exposure. Although if you go to a clinic and get a blood draw from the arm, you can get a potential result a bit quicker. I know it can seem scary sometimes to go and get tested if you're worried you might have HIV or any other STI. But testing and knowing your status really is a superpower. As soon as you do, you'll be put on treatment, and you can manage that condition and look after yourself and protect the people that you're having sex with as well. Also, just while I'm here, I want to say that sexual health clinics are free to anyone. They, regardless of, say, your immigration status or whether you have to pay for other NHS services. They're free, they're confidential, and treatment is also free. Your records are connected to any of your other health record as well, so your other healthcare professionals won't know anything about your sexual health visits. The third tool we've got is medication, and this is actually for people who have HIV. So we don't have a cure for HIV, but we do have amazing treatment. What that treatment does is it reduces the amount of virus in someone's system to the point where it can't be detected. And that does two really important things. Firstly, it keeps that person healthy. It means HIV is a manageable long-term condition like many others. And secondly, it means that that person can't pass the virus on. People on effective HIV treatment usually take just one pill a day, and they can't pass the virus on to anyone else. So those three conditions I talked about earlier, it won't matter. It won't matter if you meet any of them. Someone on effective treatment isn't a risk to you. It's huge progress that I think people probably couldn't even imagine at the beginning of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. The last tool we have are medications taken by people who don't have HIV to protect them, and they're called PrEP and PEP. So PrEP can be taken by everyone. It can be taken once a day, a bit like the way you might take the contraceptive pill. And when taken correctly, it can protect you from contracting HIV. It's available for free from sexual health clinics at the moment. The other medication is PEP. So this can be taken after a potential exposure. So if you think you're at risk or might be at risk, you can go to a sexual health clinic and talk to them about whether PEP might be appropriate for you. It has to be taken within 72 hours, but it's most effective within 24 hours. It's available within sexual health clinics, or if you can't get to one, you can go to A&E and they'll be able to prescribe it to you as well. And they're both free, those medications. Just to really reiterate here that people on effective HIV treatment can't pass on the virus. As it is LGBT plus History Month, I wanted to reflect on some of the history and where we've come from. This slide shows some of the headlines in the papers during the 80s and 90s covering the HIV and AIDS crisis and some of the language that was used. As you can see, it's really intertwined with blatant homophobia and hatred, and really, propagating fear as well amongst people. Whereas we look at the headlines today, we'd hope that we've learned our lessons, but we can see exactly the same language being used to describe the people who are transgender, drag queens. It's the same kind of fear, and unfortunately, we don't seem to have learned the lessons of the past. So I'm going to go back quickly. Stigma and discrimination can be huge problems for people living with HIV, far more so than the virus itself. You're more likely to have a mental health condition such as anxiety or depression. People living with HIV experience stigma from friends and family, in the workplace, and even within healthcare as well. It can stop people from getting tested, which means they can become more unwell. And even once you're tested, I was speaking to someone recently who told me that even after they knew they were HIV positive, they didn't start treatment for a year because of the shame and fear that they felt about having the virus. And that just meant over that time, they were becoming more and more unwell when they didn't need to. So stigma and discrimination are a huge problem that we really need to tackle. And again, by being here and educating yourself and really understanding what the realities of HIV today, you're here helping us to do that. This slide shows the timeline of where we've come from the beginning of the 80s to today. So you'll see, the first deaths in America in early 80s from what was then called gay-related immune deficiency. We see the death of Terry Higgins in 1982 and the formation of Terrence Higgins Trust. I'm sure many of you remember the national campaigns around Don't Die of Ignorance in the mid-80s. At the late 80s, we saw the approval of the first antiretroviral medication, AZT, and the first World AIDS Day, which has been happening on the 1st of December every year since, and it's where we commemorate the people that we've loved and lost. Interestingly, that was at the same time as Section 28 was also introduced in the UK. If we go forward to the mid-90s, we see the first combination therapy for HIV. So this is where different drugs are being used in combination, and they're found to be much more effective and with much less severe side effects for people taking them long-term. And this is where we start to see medication improving and becoming more effective. This came through to the 2000s. PrEP, that I mentioned before, starts becoming widely available. In the 2010s, we start seeing single pill therapies and widespread use of PrEP amongst gay and bisexual men and men who have sex with men, which is a huge part of that decrease in HIV transmission. There was a big study conducted that the evidence-based, so we know that people on effective medication can't pass the virus on. That happened in the 2010s. And in the teens and 2020, we saw that PrEP was becoming available for free on the NHS in England, Scotland, and Wales. So huge amounts of progress, which is amazing. But it's really important to recognise that that progress and those rights were the result of fights and campaigns that went hand in hand with the fight for gay rights, the fight for trans rights, and the rights of many people in these communities. Looking to the future, though, it's not all doom and gloom. It is really optimistic. We are looking to end all new cases of HIV by 2030, and it is achievable, and you can help us do it. Please share the messages that you've learned here today, share the stories, and educate yourself. Think about testing, think about PrEP and PEP if they're right for you. It would be amazing for us to be the first country in the world to end all new cases by 2030. And it would be the first time that we've ended an epidemic without a vaccine or cure. So I'm going to hand over now to Stephen, who is going to share his story, and then you're going to get from Mark. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thank you for having us today. It's great to be able to come and share our stories with you. Now, I always think it's polite to start off by telling you a few things about myself. So my name is Stephen. I'm an actor and YouTuber. I am originally from Glasgow. I'm diabetic, I'm adopted, and I love pizza and cannot stand prawns. And I also grew up in a time where there was this deadly virus called AIDS that was killing the majority of the people that it came into contact with. Now, as Jen mentioned earlier about Section 28, I grew up during Section 28, And as this little gay kid at school, I knew that I couldn't speak about it or couldn't ask advice or anything about it. So really, the sexual education that we got in school was so minimal, especially at that time, when they were so scared about talking about anything, that they would worry would influence you. So I kind of fell out of school at 18, not really knowing anything about sexual health and how to look after that side of my life. Now, let's take a jump forward, this time to 2002. I decided the time had come to leave Glasgow and head off to London, because London is where you are told that you will find fame and fortune and that the streets are paved with gold. That's not always true. And I came here and did what struggling actors do. And it really was a struggle, to be here pounding the streets, going for auditions, trying to get castings, trying to be seen by agents. It was really tough, and I lived in a flat with other actors, and we used to get together on a Sunday to have dinner together. And quite often the highlight meal of the week was beans on toast. That was as much as we could afford. So yeah, it was tough. But gradually, as the months went on, it started to get easier, and I started to be seen by better agents and casting people and get called in for better jobs and things. And then gradually and eventually that day came. And that was the day that the phone rang, and it was Andrew Lloyd Webber's people calling me. And for anybody that doesn't know, Andrew Lloyd Webber is the biggest musical theatre producer in the United Kingdom. And his office was calling me to see if I'd like to go for an audition, and for his new West End show called Bombay Dreams. And I was like, okay. So off I went to audition for Bombay Dreams. And 2 weeks later, there I was on the stage. I'd got the job. And it really was a dream come true. This little kid from Glasgow who, never imagined that this could happen. And there I was, going out on stage every single night. I would go out at the second act and sing my little heart out, this beautiful love song called Love's Never Easy. And yeah, I used to come off stage every night and I literally used to pat myself on the back and go, Stephen, you did good. Now let's take another jump forward, this time to 2006. By this time, I'd finished Bombay Dreams and I'd just split up with my long-term partner. And one of my friends called me and he said, Stephen, would you like to go out and get a couple of drinks? And I was like, yes, I really needed it. I just needed a shoulder to cry on. I was pretty cut up about splitting up with my partner. So I met up with my friend, and as he walked through the door of the bar, he was on his phone to his girlfriend. And it was 2006, so the phones were still pretty big. And he came through the door and they were arguing. They were going at it full throttle. And I was just like, okay. And then he hung up from her and we got our first drink. And we were just working through our first drink and his phone rang again. And he had to excuse himself to go outside and speak to her. So he went outside, came back in, and went outside, came back in. This happened about 3 or 4 times. And on the last time that it happened, I realized that I'd finished my drink. So I decided to order another 2 drinks. He came back through the door and he saw the 2 drinks and he just said, Stephen, I can't stay. I've got to go home now. My girlfriend's packing her bags. If I don't go now, she's going to be gone. What are you going to do? And I remember that question so clearly because I remember looking around at this busy pub in North London and looking at the clock that was on the wall in front of me, and it said 10 o'clock. And I thought, okay, I've got another hour till this pub closes. I'll finish these 2 drinks and then I'll go home. What happened after that is always kind of strange to talk about because some things are very clear and other things are quite hazy. I do remember my head suddenly feeling very, very heavy. I felt dizzy. I felt nauseous. I just didn't know what was wrong. But basically, I couldn't lift my head up. So I was sitting on a bar stool, and all I could do was have my head down here. I couldn't have my head up at all. I remember seeing a guy's shoes standing in between mine. I remember the smell of cheap aftershave. And I remember a guy's voice saying to me, "Do you need some fresh air, mate?" I was so confused and disorientated. I knew I needed help, but I was unable to ask for it. So I said yes, because I thought this person's going to help me. Now, I closed my eyes for what seemed like a split second. And when I opened them, I was blinded by sunlight and it was shining through the window. And I was like, where am I? What's going on? I was confused and, very disorientated. And I looked at the sunlight coming through the window and looked around and realized that I was in my flat. And then I looked at the clock on my bedside table and it said 10:02. And my brain was trying to compute, how can it be 10:02 and the sun shining through the window when it was 10 p.m. and it was pitch black outside? And then I realized that it was 12 hours later. And I thought, I need to get up, have a shower, and get ready for work. But when I went to stand up, my legs completely gave way. I couldn't put any weight on them at all. So I had to drag myself along the hallway to the bathroom. By the time I got to the bathroom, by holding onto the bathroom door and the towel rail, I could hold myself up. I turned on the shower and started to get undressed. I kicked off my boots and undid my jeans. And as my jeans fell to the floor, I saw that they were covered in blood. I saw that my backs of my legs were covered in blood and my underwear was covered in blood. And I remember collapsing into a heap on the floor and just saying, no, God, how can this have happened? If this would have happened, I would have remembered. And why can't I remember? And I should be able to remember. And my mind was literally about to spin out of control. And I know what they say. I know they tell you, don't wash away evidence. But I felt like my body was on fire, and that if I didn't get into the shower straight away, that was just going to be me. And that's what I did next. I got into the shower and I spent 45 minutes in there. And it is like you see it in the movies. You scrub away your skin until it bleeds. After 45 minutes had passed, I knew I needed to do something, but what was I meant to do? I didn't know. So I decided to call the hospital. I spoke to a doctor there who said, we're sending an ambulance, we're sending the police. And before I knew it, there were police and ambulance people, and the police were taking my clothes for evidence. The ambulance people were putting me into the back of the ambulance. And I remember the policeman leaning over and saying to me, what has happened? And I said, I think I've been raped. And he kind of furrowed his brow and went, but you're a man. That doesn't happen to men. Now, it was a while ago, but it was 2006. It wasn't the dark ages. So it's amazing how language matters, because for the next 2 years, I didn't call it rape because somebody in authority had told me that it wasn't that. Now, I went to the hospital and there was so much going on. I was in a room and there were doctors and nurses and blood tests being done and physical examinations. And I kind of felt as if I was up here looking down at myself. I do remember that there was a really nice Irish nurse, and she was just sitting holding my hand, and she just kept telling me, Stephen, everything's going to be all right. After a while, a doctor came in and he said to me, Stephen, from the blood work we have done, we can tell that you have Rohypnol in your blood. Now, Rohypnol was the date rape drug at the time. He then said, from the physical evidence, we can tell that you have been raped. Now, hearing somebody say it kind of made my mind want to explode again. And I felt myself getting stressed and getting panicky. And that really nice Irish nurse squeezed my hand tightly. And she said to me, "Stephen, love, all your blood tests for sexually transmitted infections have come back clear, but you must come back within 3 months for a second HIV test because it can take that long for the virus to show in your system." She said, "Just come back to make sure." Now, I left that hospital and I walked out the door and I was like, "See you later. I'm gone. I'm done. I'm never coming back here." And I went away and tried to do anything I could possibly do to forget the memories that I couldn't remember, if that makes any sense. And I started drinking heavily. I started using drugs, something I'd never done, just to try and block out these memories that I couldn't remember, and also the memories that my mind was creating. Now, after 6 months, I remember waking up one morning and thinking, I look like crap. I was just tired. I was run down. I wasn't looking after myself. And it's funny, I hadn't thought of that nurse, that nice Irish nurse, since, I'd been at the hospital, but all of a sudden she came back into my head, and I just remembered what she'd said about coming back after 3 months. Now, this was 6 months later, but I thought maybe that's what I need to do. Maybe that's going to be the start of my journey to start healing from what happened to me, go back, have an HIV test, and then move on from there. And that's what I did. I went back to have my test. I went in, had the blood test done, and an hour later, the doctor came back in and she said to me, "Stephen, I'm so sorry, but the person that raped you was HIV positive, and you now too have HIV." Well, the world kind of comes to a screeching halt when you hear those words. And I thought back to what I knew about HIV and AIDS and what I'd been taught as a kid, which, as I've told you, was nothing. And what I remember from HIV and AIDS when I was growing up as a kid in the 80s was Freddie Mercury, Rock Hudson, all the other celebrities that died, these horrible deaths from AIDS-related conditions. And I just thought, okay, that's going to be my story as well. And I went away and spent the next 2 years waiting to die. I used to go to bed every night and I would pray to God that my heart would stop beating and that my flatmates would find me in the morning and think that I died from a heart attack, because I didn't want to live with HIV and I sure as hell didn't want to die from it. And I looked on YouTube for somebody like me, couldn't find anybody, and just didn't know where to look for support. And yeah, just wanted to die. And I wanted to die for 2 years, and, really thought about taking my own life many times, but something stopped me. And then 2 years later, I woke up one morning and remember feeling really, really bored and really fed up, because I was so sick of waiting to die, because it did not look like it was going to happen anytime soon. So I kind of realized I had to start moving on with my life. And I didn't know how to do that, but somebody suggested journaling. And I was like, nah, it's not my kind of thing. If it's your thing, then great. But for me, nah. And then somebody said, why don't you write your life story? And I've had quite an interesting story. And I thought, yeah, okay, I'll write it. Now, I wrote it for me. I never, ever had any intentions of sharing it with anybody. But my agent called me one day and she said, "Stephen, I've not seen you. I've not heard from you. What are you doing?" So I had to tell her I was working on something. So I told her I was writing my story. And she said, "Can I read it?" And I thought, okay. She called me at 1:30 in the morning the following night. And I was like, oh my goodness. And all she said was, "Stephen, you need to do something with this." You need to use your story. And I suppose that's where the seed was planted. And I went away with my pages of scribbles and I put together a one-man show. I called it Shadow Dreamer, and I took it to New York in 2010 with the hope that I would maybe get 1 month over there. 1 month would have been a success for me, but that didn't happen. I didn't get a month. I ended up getting 9.5 months. My show closed off Broadway, and it was reviewed by the New York Times as vital, necessary theatre. It was then that I realized the power of our stories. And I always used to say in my show, we all have a story, whether it's a big story or a small story, whether you're telling it to an audience in New York or whether you're just telling it to your best friend. It doesn't matter. It's your story and it's important. Now, what I hope you've got from my story today is that you can live, thrive, and survive with HIV. But just let me go back to the beginning. Do you remember those things I told you? My name's Stephen, actor, YouTuber, diabetic, adopted, from Glasgow, love pizza, hate prawns. Well, HIV is just another one of those things. It's just another thing in my life that is there, but does not stop me from doing or being what I want to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was particularly moving, and it's interesting what threads we share. And I hope you'll get something from my story as I got something from yours. I am going to talk about testing and medication, building upon what Jen said, but that's going to be at the end. What I'm here today is, I understand it's not only testing week, but it's History Month. And I now consider myself in my retirement as a living piece of history, which you'll guess at the end of this talk. But what I want to talk to you, I want to tell you a story. And this is a story about a young man who came to London. Blue-eyed, rosy cheeks, dimples, and a smile as warm as a morning sunshine. And the story of this boy's arrival in London is the same as Stephen's. It's the same as thousands of others, particularly men and women who came to London in the late 70s. And we're looking for something, looking to get away from something, and in my case, wanted to find out what it was like to be someone else in another place. But of course, London, big city in the 70s, still is even bigger these days. Where do you start? How do you make friends? And just how do you manage to cope in a city like that? And I was very lucky. My mum had given me a Nicholson's Guide to London. And I opened it up, and it just happened to open on the page where it said homosexual listings. That's what we would call ourselves those days. And I just happened to spot under the meagre offerings for those days, it was 1977, I happened to spot Gay Switchboard. And I thought, well, let's give them a call. I happened to have 2p in my pocket at the time, which was enough for about a 10-minute call. And I happened to be standing by a phone box, all very serendipitous. Anyway, I called the number. And the guy answered, and he said, "Great Switchboard, how can we help you?" I said, What? He said, "Say that again." "I think I'm a homosexual." To which he replied, and it still makes me smile, "Well, what are you? You either are or you're not a homosexual. Make your mind up." And in that second of self-recognition, I think, yes, he was absolutely right. I am one of those. So I thought, well, let's keep this going. And what I then said to him was, well, what do I do? This is a big city. This is my first day here. And looking back now, I think this man was remarkable, because what he could have done was he could have sent me off to a pub. He could have sent me off to a club, all those places where you're kind of prone to predatory influence. But what he did was something much, much more radical. And I appreciate that now looking back. I didn't at the time have any concept of what gay liberation was about, what being gay was. I didn't even know that the Obscenity Act forbade me from kissing anyone or even holding hands in public, because children and adults are very sensitive to that kind of thing. Well, they were at the time. But what he did was much more radical than sending me to a pub. He sent me to the world's first gay teenage group, which itself, when you consider the age of consent was 21 at the time, was a hugely radical service. And as I said, it was the only one at that time. And I had no apprehension about that. I was happy to go to anything. And as I made my way to 296 and I climbed those steep stairs, I thought, what am I getting myself into? But it could only be better than going to the pubs or bars. And what I found there was a unique space. But there was about possibly 20 young men there. There were no women at that time. It took in women later on, but 20 young men. And what I found out in that sort of sunny afternoon was that teenagers don't have to be cruel. I can make friends anywhere. And not more particularly how ordinary we were. And it was a really fun afternoon. I learned a lot about sex that day, and I learned that size mattered, which was something that was quite unique to me. But I also learned 101 ways to dress my hair at the time. But it was all great fun, and I look back at those times very, very fondly. And that was my family for 2 years. And after that, after those 2 years, I sort of made my own way, got my flat, got a decent job, and carried on living. And that life was good. It was the late 70s. Went to Heaven, the Oakley nightclub, had a great time. Until that one day in February 1982, when my doctor said, you need to get you to hospital right away. So I thought, okay, let's go to hospital. I mean, I had been feeling pretty sick for 2 weeks. And it's one of those things I thought, well, surely it's going to go. It's just glandular fever. Well, I don't suppose you get with glandular fever, I suppose you get swollen spleen, swollen lymph nodes the size of golf balls, and a liver that's enlarged. So it was pretty serious. And when I got to the hospital, I told them I was gay. And I'm glad I did, because, gosh, I got my own room en suite. I got room service delivered on a tray onto the floor. And most exciting of all, was I got all the staff came in wearing wonderful white suits with a bit of a mask over their face. Didn't know what the hell was going on. But I was there for a while, and we did all the tests, all the prods and the pokes and the spleen extraction, the liver extraction, the marrow extraction. And at the end of it, this wonderful consultant, and I do mean this genuinely, this wonderful consultant came up to me as I was about to be discharged. He said, look, Mark, you've got nothing that we can find, but we think you've got this thing that's coming over from America. And of course, I kind of knew what it was, because I had a flatmate called Simon, who was a bit of a hypochondriac, and his thing recently, the year before, had been that he was going to spontaneously combust. So when, of course, the thing from America came over, he had something real to latch onto. So I knew a little bit about it. And I do recall thinking, oh, okay. And he said to me, I'm ever so sorry, Mark, there's nothing we can do about it. I don't know what to say. And of course, being in my very, very early 20s, I can't recall how I responded. I think I just went back home, and then I went back to work, as you do. And one of the lessons, the great lessons of the teenage group, one of the things I took away from that was very early on, and the advice was very clear from all of the guys there, was if you're going to start having sex, make sure you start going to an STD clinic. So by the time 1985 came around, I was a regular at the Westminster Hospital, the STD clinic, a little place really in the basement of the hospital, the arse end of the hospital, I used to call it. And it was there that I was working with, or my doctor was a Dr. Samar Singh. Now, this was 1985, and AIDS was pretty much in the forefront. It was everywhere. In the gay community at the time, it was a very small community. We were pretty much scared to death. You could not get through the day without a barrage of news items, either on the news or the paper, about this condition. And of course, the representations of it were absolutely horrific. All you have to do is just go into any archive and look at the pictures of those poor souls who evidence themselves so strongly. It was a truly, truly terrible time. And I think it was about my third visit to the SCD. I used to go about every 6 months, because while I was sexually active, I wasn't overly active. But I just thought it was good practice, and I still do think it's good practice to get checked out regularly. But anyway, this doctor, Dr. Samar Singh, he said to me, Mark, we need to get you tested. I encourage you to do it as I encourage all of my patients to do that. So I did, bearing in mind what I had been told a couple of years earlier. And of course, when it came back, it was HIV positive. And Dr. Samar Singh said, well, look, come on, you need to go home. You've got 6 months to live. Even now it makes me chuckle. 6 months to live. And so I did go home. And I can't remember what I felt at the time. It's so long ago, but I do remember going home and packing a suitcase just in case I needed it for hospital. But nothing happened. I was, despite the diagnosis, in the rudest of health. I'm 95% Irish, and my family has longevity written into its DNA. But nothing, there was nothing to do. There's nothing, the doctor could offer nothing at that time. There were no medications. The idea of prophylactic approach to health wasn't even discussed at that time. And certainly there was no conception of what we now know as viral load, which is really essentially the amount of virus copies you've got in your body. We didn't know anything about that. And so I went back to work and I lived with this. And I don't think I was really that panicked, because I think when you've got that, when you look in the mirror and you see yourself as being in the best of health and looking great and so forth, you don't really kind of bring it together. And that's what I did. I went back to work. And then, of course, and that was pretty much it for the next few years. I went back to work, and I do recall hearing about AZT, which Jen referred to, the very first nucleoside reverse transcript inhibitor, the very first class of drugs. Now, just let me take a step aside for a moment. There are currently 6 classes of drugs. And within each class, there could be up to 20 or perhaps less, 13 or 15 types of drugs. And each class of drugs approaches or attacks HIV in different ways. And of course, if you become resistant to one, meaning that if you take a drug and you fail to take it, you fail to adhere, the virus finds a way around that drug. And in theory, you become resistant, which means a whole class of drugs is prohibited to you. But of course, we didn't know that in 1987. And what I would say about AZT is I decided to do it. And I did it not as somebody said to me recently, oh, you were a lab rat or you were a guinea pig. Not at all. I did it like the rest of us because we were shit scared about what could happen. There was nothing else. I tried everything complementary, and I knew that the virus was making its inroads into me because there were slight tweaks in my health that I was beginning to notice. So I took AZT, but I did my research. And I called a friend in Los Angeles, and he said, no, don't take it. But I couldn't stop myself. I took it, and none of us could stop ourselves in those days. And we did, and I have to say it was the worst thing I've ever done, because I look back at photographs now of me before and after AZT, before I'm this sort of 24-year-old healthy kid with those blue eyes and that pretty smile. And then when 3 months into the AZT, I looked like I'm a zombie, The Walking Dead. I look so tired. And I think it was at that point when I saw that photograph that I decided enough is enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. And after 6 months, I regressed back into a reasonable level of health, but I never quite got over it, perhaps because of the anemia it caused or the impact on white blood cells, I don't know. But we're now getting into the bit about medication. And medication, this is the thing about AZT. It was the first drug. It was a very controversial drug. It was very divisive in the community in the way it impacted. There was those who were against it and those who were for it. This was a few years later, and it was one of those drugs that just split the community. But it was a start of something, and it really kick-started our understanding of medication and HIV. And it wasn't long before there was a whole palette of nucleoside analogues that we could take. And I'm thinking of DDI, DDC, and we did DDC, D4T, AZT, Stovidin, and so on. I'm sure you get the picture. And this was now entering the stage of dual therapy. The problem with this is that dual therapy, it was a mark forward. But of course, what we didn't know at the time was viral load and resistance. And what we also didn't know at the time was that really 2 drugs was never enough. But we did them anyway. Well, I didn't, because I decided not to. Because I was still in that flush of youth and still felt and looked reasonable. But I know the side effects were frigging awful. I had friends who had peripheral neuropathy as well. Now, peripheral neuropathy is where the sheath in your nerves at the end of your fingers or your feet is eroded. So what that means is the nerve is exposed. And so the slightest touch can send you into spasms of pain. And it was awful. It was, you could see, I had friends and they were hobbling around, they could barely walk, they couldn't pick things up. It was pretty awful. And the thing is, even if you come off the drugs, you never really sufficiently recover. And it was horrible to see, amidst all everything else that was going on. And this was around early 90s, and it was really the height of it. And when I mean the height of it, I remember Capital Gay, which was the free magazine at the time. And what you had in Capital Gay, think the Evening Standard size, in the middle of that was, the middle pages was crammed full of obituaries. That's how rough it was at the time. But nucleoside analogues, that's what we did. And unfortunately, for those people who did that class of drugs, because they didn't last in their efficacy, they became resistant to that class of drugs. And there really wasn't anything else until 1996. Now, this was the Vancouver AIDS conference, and I was there myself. And I remember being in that hall when we were told of the results of the year's study that combined nucleoside analogues, NRITs as they were called, TIs rather, and protease inhibitors. And I remember, as clear as the breakfast I had this morning, which was porridge, by the way, I remember the relief, the sigh of relief that went through the hall. It wasn't a jubilation, it wasn't New Year's Eve start, it was thank God. And then there was a huge sense that we had turned a corner. What I also saw, and I found with other people I met there, was the terrible, terrible sadness of the people who didn't make it. I had a friend who died 2 weeks before the Vancouver conference, or the day that it was announced. And the drugs wouldn't have helped him. He was really just too ill. But I think it would have given him a sense of something, and content that it was almost over. Because from the moment we had AIDS in 1982, we longed and we lived for the day that we get to the time when it was all over. And indeed, the whole combination of protease inhibitors and NRITs, it wasn't a miracle, it was science. But you heard, and I saw, and I had friends who literally rose up from their bed after this combination. And my God, I can't tell you what it was like. It was wonderful. But boy, we didn't know what was around the corner. And that's the odd thing about this, because there we were, suddenly with something that was going to make us well. But boy, we didn't know what was coming. And there's an expression we started to use at the time, because as soon as I got back to the UK, I went on to triple combination, which is 2 nucleoside analogues and saquinimab. And boy, there's an expression that we used, and it was the world fell out of your ass. And what that meant was, and it's forgive my impoliteness, but this is what it was. It meant that you were really suffering from the side effects of Crixaban or saquinimab. Because what it did, it really blew out your ass. And you were unlucky if you could get off the toilet seat for hours it met. It was horrible. And the only reason you managed to get off the toilet seat was there's nothing else to come out. And that was really the horror of it. And I don't think we should evade the horror of these drugs, even those times, because it was real. And of course, the other side effect, the side effect of facial lipoatrophy and lipodystrophy, what this means is that some people, they're completely stripped of fat in their face. Other people have odd shapes in their body. It's completely stripped of their ass or their legs. And the weird thing about it was you felt fantastic. You felt, my God, this is what it's like to be healthy again. You look in the mirror and you look like somebody who's been abusing drugs for years and years and years. And I remember friends getting shouted that junkie, they would be called. And it was really, really horrible. It was truly horrendous side effects. And there are other ones as well, of course, nightmares, dizziness, sleepiness. I don't mean to sort of over dramatize it, but these were things that happened. And then, of course, I went 2 years after that. I had enough of this. I thought it's better to die. It was that bad. And I know I wasn't alone in that sentiment. And I said to my doctor, Stephen, and he's now Professor Ass retired, I said, I need to get off this. I can't do this anymore. I'm just wasting away in the way that we used to waste away with AIDS. And he said, oh, Mark, I'm so happy for you because we have a new drug. And it was a new class of drugs, and it was non-nucleoside reverse transcript inhibitors. And don't ask me what that is. It just means it's a different entry point for the virus. And I got off protease inhibitors and I went on that. and that was it. I think that marked the point in 2007 when the drugs started to get better. And by this time, I think I took mine in 2002. That new combination, and I was back at work at this time, and people were starting to question why you look so different. Unfortunately, I was able to reverse that by going on these non-nucleoside drugs. And since then, I went back to work in 1999. I retired in October 22. Since then, I've been pretty much on the same combination therapy. And I suppose the point of all this is what we're getting to, is, I'm coming to the end now, is in terms of going for a test. I know this is testing week as well as history week. And going for a test, when I've spoken to people, there's a whole range of issues why they are frightened to go for a test. And interestingly enough, one of them is to do with medication and the side effects of medication. Now, if you look at those 6 classes of drugs, and if you look at what's available today, the expertise, the understanding, the knowledge in how to apply those drugs effectively to minimize side effects, to minimize your daily pill take to 1 a day, they've even got injectables on the horizon, is staggering compared to what I remember. And there really is nothing to be frightened of, because the side effects are minimal. There's side effects to everything. And if you were to tell anyone from the past, would you rather have a medication or not a medication, they would always say, I'd rather have any little side effect than have what AIDS might bring me. And I use that word because it's in a historical context, because the effects outweigh the risks of not having medication. So I'm coming to an end now. What I would like to say to you is, if you haven't been tested and medication is a worry of you, don't be worried about it, because all the hard work has been done for you. So that we have this marvelous palette of medication that you can access. So don't be afraid, go and get tested. And as you can see from Stephen and I, HIV isn't really that intrusive anymore. It's a little thing, part of my life. It means I go to the hospital once a year, take my pills, but I don't think about it. It's that inconsequential almost, which of course is very different from the old days. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you to both of our speakers for sharing their stories. It's the first time that I've actually heard Mark speak, so yeah, it's really moving. We haven't actually had any comments come in, any questions come in, sorry, but we have had some comments and people just saying, thank you for sharing your experiences with us, for your stories with us, and just, apologizing or saying, they're so sorry that you've had such horrendous experiences over the years. I think we will wrap that up there. I know we were going to share a slide with you at the end with some of the information on there for support organisations, which should be popping up shortly. There's also on there a link to fill out an evaluation form. Get my words straight today, apologies. And it'd be really helpful if you can fill that in for us. It just lets us know what you thought of the session and gives us some information. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us today and spending the time with us. Really appreciate it.